Yeah, I'll get them. Nope. Press. Yep. You see the over here? No, it's not. And it goes red. Okay.
Velkomin á fundin, ef ekki bara að byrja. Klukkan 12 og við ætlum að ljúka fundinum eigi síðar en 1:30 í síðasta lagi. Jeremy Corbyn að fara í flug klukkan 4, við þurfum að sleppa honum frá okkur þá, en þessi fundir svona eiginlega formáli að umræðu. Formáli að umræðu. Við erum svona eins konar pírómanar, sko, að kveikja upp í samfélaginu og örva til umræðu. Ég sé hér að fólk ég kannast við fólk svona víða að úr pólitíkinni, en þau koma svona miklu leyti úr einni átt og mín tilfinning svo að þessi mikla mæting segja okkur eitt: sósíalisminn að taka flugið. Og það sósíalismi sem við ætlum að ræða. We are going to talk about socialism. And we have here with us Jeremy Corbyn, whom you know, all of you, I'm sure, a veteran socialist politician from Britain, leader of the Labour Party in the UK, 2015 till 2020. I recall that in 2017 the Labour Party got more votes in England than any other party, and this is the first time this has happened. It was under Jeremy Corbyn that the Labour Party was more victorious than it had been at any time before. Contrary to what we read in the newspapers, he got more votes than Brown, not more votes than Tony Blair the first time, but after that, always more victorious. But the political system in England or UK is such that it depends on other things than the number of votes, of course. Now, I say he was leader of the Labour Party 2015 till 2020. A lot of things have happened, and he had some troubles in between, as we know. But we are not going to delve into the past. We are concerned with the future. And Jeremy Corbyn is occupied with the future, with this new organization, should I call it an organization, Peace and Justice. He's going, no doubt, to tell us about this, and we will talk about this and talk about the future, what we can do in the future for making our society and the world better. But as I say, we finish the meeting at 1:30 at the latest, and even if there are 15 people wanting to speak, then we'll finish the meeting and we will speak afterwards in the coffee houses and elsewhere. But now we are going to talk about socialism in the future. Has it a future? Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me. And it's great to campaign alongside you on so many international causes. And tomorrow you'll be in Brussels speaking up for Julian Assange, and I hope everybody here will support the campaign for the freedom of Julian Assange. He has suffered all these years in prison, and his big crime, telling the truth. So let's support him. And this is, sadly for me, the first time I've been to Iceland, but it certainly is not the last time. It's been a wonderful few days here, and my work has been mainly with the Council of Europe Migration Committee, discussing issues about migration, and unfortunately having to have some very stern conversations with many what I consider to be far-right politicians from different parts of Europe who are provoking the most horrible and unbelievable hostility towards refugees in different parts of Europe. And in my own country, there is an attempt by the government to remove asylum seekers to Rwanda and to claim that the people crossing the channel from France in small boats are somehow or other an invasion force in the country. What we need is safe routes for asylum seekers and a recognition that they are human beings trying to find a place of safety in a very dangerous world. And surely when the history of the 21st century is written, the unbelievable levels of hostility towards victims of war, human rights abuse, environmental degradation, and poverty is going to be very harsh on those politicians that refuse to do anything to give them a place of safety. And so my message is, we have to be global in our thinking and global in our challenges against inequality, environmental destruction, the devastation of war, but above all, of giving hope for the next generation. It's very easy to unleash nasty right-wing negative forces. It's very hard to put them back in the bottle once they've got out. And that's why the resolute actions of socialists and good people all over Europe in defending the right of asylum is, to me, a very, very important message that we have to put out there as strongly as we possibly can. My time as leader of the Labour Party was, to me, a fascinating one, and I was, before I became leader of the Labour Party, very well aware of the power of the establishment in Britain and of the media attempts at character assassination of individuals. My only crime was underestimating their power and underestimating the ability of the media to destroy or try and destroy and denigrate an individual. And I was talking to my old friend Arthur Scargill, who was the leader of the British mine workers during the big strike of 84, 85. And he said, I saw him in Wales, and he said, Jeremy, I thought I got the record. I said, record for what, Arthur? He said, getting the most abuse in the newspapers, but you've passed me now, and you're now top of the league in that respect. And so it is important to remember why the members of the Labour Party and supporters of the Labour Party voted the way they did in 2015. Fundamentally, it was about economic policies and austerity. The 2008 banking crisis was a crisis of massive proportions. Massive proportions because the banking system had fundamentally collapsed, and the response of most governments was to look after their friends in the banking system and cut spending on schools, on hospitals, on roads, on railways, on parks, and to freeze wages in the public sector as an encouragement to freeze wages in the private sector. In most countries, the bankers were rewarded for what they had achieved, the destruction of so much of the social wage. Not in Iceland, where you did things very, very differently, and I'll be interested to hear more about that. But my message was then that for the left to win, for socialists to win, they couldn't just manage a private sector-led, banking sector-led economy. It had to be a deeply interventionist government that would start to redress the balance and the inequality that is so strong and so prevalent in all of the capitalist economies around the world. And so my message was about wages, social wage and conditions, and that we would have to raise taxation at a corporate level and introduce a wealth tax. And I'll give you just one example of what a very small wealth tax could achieve. A 1% wealth tax in Britain on wealth of over £10 million would release several billion pounds, enough to redress, for example, one of the nastiest social policies, which is giving no benefits to the children in larger families. Just one example of what could be achieved by a very, very minor step in that direction. But it does require political courage to say you are prepared to raise tax on the richest, you are prepared to redistribute wealth and power, and it also requires an education campaign and a political activist campaign to achieve that. The other messages in the programme we put forward, it wasn't me, I was doing it on behalf of a very large number of other people, was environmental, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes later on in what I have to say. But simply to put it this way, there is an environmental crisis in the planet. There is an environmental crisis that affects the poorest, most working class communities the most, and affects people living in vulnerable island states first, but eventually nobody can escape it. It is up to our generation to do something about it. And you won't solve it with a free market economy. You will only solve it by intervention and the sort of socialist principles that we adopt. The third point was one of peace. I've spent my life in the peace movement. I joined the campaign for nuclear disarmament when I was in school. And I'm still proud to say I'm a member and indeed an honorary officer of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. I want to see a world free from nuclear weapons and free from the spectre of the destruction of this planet by nuclear weapons. If human beings are capable of developing nuclear weapons, then human beings are capable of abolishing nuclear weapons and pledging never ever to use them. And that was the principle that I put forward. How you achieve change, though, in society is the very hard part about it. And that is that we're all brought up in an age of information and media being thrown at us. I'm about the same age as your good self, I think. No, you're older than me. You're even wiser. Much wiser. And in those days, as a young person, I used to sell newspapers for a job, for a school job, and there were 6 or 7 different titles, delivered and sold those titles, and that was the main source of information people had, plus radio and some television news. Now there are few newspapers, but thousands and thousands of sources of online information and algorithms that drive us in a particular direction and form opinions in that way. There is no uniformity in the news we receive. There's no uniformity in the quality or accuracy of the news that we receive. And I'll come back to this at the end of my talk about how we deal with issues about access to the media and control of the media, control in the sense of providing space for people to express themselves. And so it is about those issues. I'm also in the process of writing a book at the moment about not just the 5 years of leadership and the process since then, but also a much wider sweep of the political history and activities that I've been involved with. Indeed, I was writing it till very late last night, which is why I look so tired this morning. But there we go. And that is being written because I believe it should, and it's an interesting experience, and I hope you'll maybe buy a copy or read a copy when it comes out next year. But we founded the Peace and Justice Project in 2021 as a way of giving a political home for people who in Britain were either in the Labour Party or no longer in the Labour Party or had never been in the Labour Party. Is designed to be a project that works in a number of directions and provides a home and activity for people. And so, for example, it's at the printers now, we're producing a poetry book called Poetry for the Many, jointly written by Len McCluskey, the former General Secretary of Unite the Union, and myself. And it's a selection of poems. Also, Maxine Peake and Michael Rosen and a number of others have chosen poems and explained why they've chosen them. And this, we were slightly skeptical about the public reaction for it, but Len and I decided we'd take a plunge and organise a poetry evening in Liverpool last year. And we did, and I was very surprised when hundreds and hundreds of people turned up to listen to and discuss poetry. And interestingly, a lot of young people turned up and wanted to read their own poems out. So I said, go ahead. So they all picked up their mobile phones and read out the poems they'd written. The imagination that's there in people, but they feel shy to present it because it's sort of not cool, it's not a good thing to be seen to be doing. It is about imagination, and the imagination of working class communities and the class distinction that goes into so much of art and literature, theatre and classical music is something that we have to challenge. So I'm proud that our project does that. But we're also involved in campaigns in support of union recognition in a number of companies around the UK. We're also involved in a right to clothing campaign as well as a right to food campaign. And on November the 12th, we're organising an international conference in London, which will be a combination of online and a physical conference, and it will be strongly supported by Progressive International and a number of trade union internationals, including the International Transport Workers Federation. The idea being that we hear and listen to and take part in voices of people all over the world, Africa, Latin America, South Asia, Europe, North America, and so on, discussing issues of environment, issues of social justice, but above all, issues of economic justice as well, and the global attack on working class living standards and wages. And I'm absolutely looking forward to that. And we produced a simple 5 demands that we've put forward as a way of uniting people. They're not the last word in a political manifesto. They're not a detailed explanation how each issue will be achieved, but they're designed to be uniting of the left, because I'm sure there are many people in this audience that have spent their lives in trade unions and political parties, and the 2 great features of the left are, one is they're lovely people and love each other, and the second feature is they love to disagree and argue at the same time, and sometimes fall out rather badly in that process. And so what I've tried to do is put forward these 5 points, and I'll just quickly read them. 1, a real pay rise for all. Wage levels have fallen in the case of Britain by 20% over the past decade. And the levels of poverty in the 5th richest country in the world are appalling and astonishing. In my own constituency in North London, there are almost half the children living in relative poverty. There are 12 food banks, which a queue lines up an hour before they open each week in order that people can get food that's been donated, and there's the growth of a number of food co-ops. That is what is behind all the wage demands and the strikes of the last few months in Britain, by civil servants, by teachers, by rail workers, by health workers, by housing workers, and in a large number of private sector industries. I wouldn't say every strike has been won, it hasn't, but in many cases, substantial pay rises have been achieved, but also the attempt by the employers to damage working conditions, for example, in our mail system known as Royal Mail, where the management tried to introduce the equivalent of Amazon's style of employment, was defeated by the strike action taken by the workers. But defeating something isn't the same as winning something. What you've done is protected what you've got, but when you actually need far more. So that has been instructive. But to me, what has been equally instructive has been that all of the disputes have enjoyed a lot of public support. And 3 days ago, I was on the demonstration outside our local hospital with the hospital doctors. Now, hospital doctors are highly skilled, very dedicated people who've studied for 7 years to become a doctor. Their wage levels are now about £14 an hour, which is not very high by any manner of means. And they're very dedicated people, and they've had enough, and so they took strike action. I've been involved in disputes in the public sector. I was a former trade union organizer in the public sector, and sometimes it's hard to explain to the public why you're taking action when they're clearly inconvenienced as a result. Very different now, very, very different. Large numbers of people just came by and said, we support the doctors, we support the nurses, even though our appointments have been cancelled or put back and so on. There is a difference and an understanding about that. The second part is a Green New Deal through public ownership, because if we are to achieve the environmental sustainability that we want in our society, it's not going to be done through the private sector. It's only going to be done through public investment and a strategy that doesn't blame people for working in polluted industries, doesn't blame the truck driver for driving a diesel truck, or anyone else that's working in the case of Britain in, for example, the steel industry or something else. There has to be a different process, which is why we put forward in both of our manifestos the principles of a green industrial revolution, which would protect jobs whilst converting them to being much more sustainable. Because we've been through the destruction of manufacturing industry under Margaret Thatcher, the destruction of the coal industry, also under Margaret Thatcher and John Major, and the removal of industries from whole swathes of northern England and the Midlands in England, with very little put in its place. And that's left behind a residue of anger, poverty, and social disruption. It's not the fault of those people that worked in steel or mines. It is the fault of those that failed to plan for the future and failed to protect those economies. And so I was very clear that there had to be a very substantially funded green investment bank in order to help us take ourselves through to a more sustainable position. And in our promotion of public ownership, I was very keen that we take back into public ownership the railway system. At the moment, the track is owned by the public, but not the train companies or the freight companies. The mail system, which was privatised under John Major's government and then David Cameron's government, and also take back the energy companies and the water industry into public ownership. And the last one, I just find it astonishing that Britain is one of the few countries in the world that seems to think water is a commodity to be bought and sold and traded rather than a basic human right. None of us in this room could last more than 24, 36 hours without water. It's absolutely essential part of life. We have it privatised, and the profits that have been made from the water industry, as they call it in Britain, are absolutely huge. And those profits are made on the back of not investing in protecting the infrastructure or the environment. And last year alone in England, not the whole of the UK, just England, there were 300,000 discharges of raw sewage into English rivers. Most rivers are now unsafe for people to swim in. The fish stocks have gone down, and the pollution off the sea has gone down as well. And as we all know, if Britain pours sewage into the rivers, it goes into the sea, it all ends up somewhere. Everyone in the whole planet is affected by everybody else's pollution. You cannot do it on your own. And the pollution obviously knows no boundaries. And so our arguments for public ownership are all, I believe, very correct and very strong. But I would also say that public ownership should also be democratic. And so that the consumers have powers over the way the service is run. Those that work in the industry, whose skills have made it what it is, have some powers as well as local authorities and so on. So the idea was a much more democratic form of public ownership rather than state institutions just running an industry in much the same way as they would run it if it were in the private sector. I think that's a fundamental argument about the empowerment of people and bringing about democracy in our society. We have an enormous housing problem in Britain at the present time with unprecedented numbers of people homeless, either in very overcrowded situations or in some cases sleeping rough on the streets. And under Margaret Thatcher, the Tory government, they sold a lot of council housing, social housing, with huge discounts. And it was obviously very attractive. If you were a tenant in a council place, you could buy it at well under the market value, sell it on, and move on with your life. In other words, the individual was given quite a big reward for having had the opportunity of a council house. And it all sounded great to people in 1979 and 1980. Here we are, 40 years later. Nearly all of those flats are now in the private rented sector, being rented out at more than double the rate that the council would charge or the social housing landlord would charge, and a great deal of poverty as a result of it. by appealing to people's greed rather than the needs of the majority, Thatcher was able to get herself a majority, but the long-term destruction of the social infrastructure of our society carries on and is very serious indeed. So our proposals are for building, in the case of Britain, at least 1 million council homes each year, and full control and regulation of the private rented sector to stop the unbelievable levels of profiteering. Most people, young people particularly, living in London or any of the other big cities in Britain, pay well over half of their disposable income every week just on rent in order to live. And so that means many people are sharing and living in a very overcrowded situation. Housing is a human right. And it's there in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's there in all the UN statutes. The last 2 points I'll be brief on. One is on the principles of the National Health Service and taxation to fund it. Our National Health Service is almost unique. It was set up after the Second World War by Aneurin Bevan, who had been a coal miner in South Wales, and was very much on the left of the Labour Party. Indeed, he was suspended from the Labour Party in the 1930s. I know the feeling. And he was nevertheless determined to carry on with his political campaigning, and eventually became the Minister of Health and Housing in 1945 Labour government, which surprisingly won the election despite the popularity of Winston Churchill at the time. And he was determined to deal with the issue of health. And he did it from the principles of the community that he grew up in a place called Tredegar in South Wales, a mining town. Pretty well everybody worked for the coal mine there. And under that government, the coal mines were taken into public ownership, therefore they became, in that sense, public employees. But the lesson he took from it was that the miners together had set up a welfare institute. That welfare institute provided health care for the whole town. The principle being that everybody should have a right to see a doctor, a dentist, an optician, a right to go to hospital without having to pay. They paid for it through the collection of union subscriptions and subscriptions to the welfare. And he wanted this principle to be adopted nationally, that we would have a taxpayer-funded National Health Service, not insurance-based, not charging, totally free at the point of need. And it was dramatic and brave, because after the Second World War, like your country and many others, there was economic devastation, massive debts, and a huge need for rebuilding all the damage of the war. But he was determined that rebuilding the damage from the war would be done in the interest of the community and public as a whole, rather than giving tax cuts and more money to the richer individuals. And so the National Health Service was established, healthcare free at the point of need. It's constantly been under attack ever since it was established in the 1940s. Under attack from vested interests, and in particular from the 2012 Health and Social Care Act, which the Conservative government put through, which promoted the idea of contracting out health services to particular companies. So a company would take over the running of a pharmacy service, somebody else take over the running of the ambulance service, and so on. They would all be labelled as National Health Service services, but in reality, they're run by the private sector. And in 2019, I discovered that the British government was having secret talks with the United States about opening up the British health market, as they called it, to American health interests. I revealed this during the election campaign, and I was denounced by the right-wing papers in Britain as spreading Russian propaganda. I'm still puzzled by this one. This one really does confuse me. And they refused to take seriously what was happening. Straight after the election, we discovered what had happened. An American company had already been given 45 doctors' practices to run, and are now the biggest providers of GP practices in the country. They've developed a market for health, When we don't need a market, we need a social justice for health, where health is provided free at the point of need. And that demand absolutely continues to end the social market or end the free market in the health service. And so you plan for the needs of people rather than the profit of the individuals. And if you think about it, if you're a manager in a hospital or a health service, you need to know that you can call on every department in the hospital. You can call on the demands of social care or whatever to deal with the patient that's in front of you. You don't need to be deciding which company you will award that contract to look after this person. You need to be there solely focused on the needs of the patient. And we still have a National Health Service, and I'm proud of that, but it is under threat and under attack. A very close friend of mine, an American guy, who died from cancer in Britain 4 years ago, wrote a wonderful book called Living with Cancer. His name was Mike Marcuse. And he had become a British national. He'd been in Britain a very long time. He came in opposition to the Vietnam War. And he had a very rare form of blood cancer. And he was treated very, very well. And his life was prolonged by many years because of the treatment he received. He, very smart guy, during his time in hospital, calculated the entire cost of the health care he had received, completely free. And he then calculated the total wealth of all of his extended family in the United States, his immediate family, his brother's family, and so on and so on, and realized that had he been a citizen of the USA, the entirety of his family would have been forced into bankruptcy to pay his medical bills and more after that. In other words, if he'd been in the USA, unless he had a gold-plated insurance, which would be very hard and very expensive to get, particularly if you had a pre-existing condition, he would have been left to die, as the poor in the USA are at the present time. And so, if nothing else, socialists around the world can unite around the principle of health care free at the point of need for all. It's there in the World Health Organization statutes, and surely the COVID pandemic, if it taught us anything, taught us that we're all vulnerable to everybody else's ill health. It's in the interest of all of us that we not just personally keep healthy, but we have a health system that keeps the entire community healthy. And so we are extremely passionate about that. That means taxation to pay for those public services. And if we don't start to redress the levels of imbalance within our societies, imbalance promoted by global economic thinking, which says the only way for economic growth to go forward is by lowering the tax burden, as it's called, on the very richest people. Hello. Ah, the youngsters are here, wonderful. That is the sort of central points of the domestic agenda we're putting forward. The last point is where I started, on refugees and welcoming refugees to our society. I have visited refugee camps all around the world on many occasions, and my constituency includes people from all over the world. Indeed, there are probably 90 to 100 different languages spoken in my constituency, and it's a complicated joy to represent it, because you learn something new every single day of the determination of individuals. And when I hear people yesterday telling me that refugees are a burden on our society, I point out, one, most European countries have a falling birth rate and falling population. Two, most have massive shortages of people to work within the health and care sectors, engineering, education, transport, and so much else. And three, and this is the interesting one, if you're a migrant or a refugee, you're less likely to be claiming social security benefits than the majority of the population. You're more likely to be working and contributing to the population through the taxation that you pay. And then, think of why people are refugees and the human story that's behind it. There's one story I'll just quickly tell you, was it stuck in my mind ever since. Before the war broke out in Syria, there was an issue of Palestinian refugees stuck on the border between Iraq and Syria. They'd left Iraq, but they hadn't been admitted to Syria. And there was a large number of them stuck in what can only be described as no man's land on the border between the two countries. And 3 of us went there to see what we could do to help support them. It was very complicated getting there. It took hours and hours to get to this camp, and we finally got there. And we were admitted to the camp eventually, and met the people there. This was the middle of winter. It was horrible weather. It was cold. It was wet. It was devoid of much support. They got some food, but that was about it. Not much else. And they've been trying to heat plastic tents by putting gas burners in them. And some people had died when the tents caught fire, and they died in the plastic burning there. A horrible way to go. These people are guilty of nothing other than trying to survive. And so I sat down with one family and talked to them. And as a young girl, she was probably about 14 or so. And she told me about her life and when they'd moved from place to place and escaped here and escaped there, homeless here and homeless there and so on. She's a very smart girl and had picked up an education along the way in short-term bursts in schools in different places. So my final question to her was, what do you want to achieve? What do you want to do in your life? And she looked at me and she said, "Sir, I want to be a doctor." I said, "Good. And why do you want to be a doctor?" And she said, "To help people that are worse off than me." A refugee in a tent, in a camp, in the middle of nowhere, with no papers, wants to help people that she thinks are worse off than her. Well, there's a good story, a good ending to it, actually. We eventually negotiated their entry to Syria, and some of them moved on to other countries, and I absolutely hope that she achieves her ambition. There are so many people with those kind of stories, but they're wasting their lives away in refugee camps in Jordan, in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Bangladesh, and so many other places. And in the last few years, 30,000 people have drowned trying to cross the Mediterranean. It's not good enough to send warships to stop people entering Europe. It's much better if Europe wakes up to the causes of migration, the causes of fleeing, and does something about that rather than blaming the victims of war and environmental destruction and human rights abuse. And so there is so much that we need and have to do as people that want to change the world around us. And that means looking at the environmental process as crucial and important and central to our lives. We can't deny what is happening. We can't deny that global warming is taking place. We can't deny that extreme and unusual weather patterns, the once in 100 years storm, the once in 100 years drought, the once in 100 years series of forest fires, are now happening every year. You cannot deny what is happening all around us. You cannot deny the melting of both polar ice caps and the effect that is going to have. And also, you cannot deny that the societies in which we live create massive levels of pollution and health effects, as I said at the beginning, on the poorest people in the poorest communities. Thus, children growing up alongside major roads in my country, in India, in the United States, before they even start school, have lost sometimes 15% of their lung capacity because of the foul air that they're breathing. We cannot go on like that. That means there has to be some dramatic change. And this then leads you on to the questions about production for need or production for profit, very fundamental questions for socialists. Do we produce things because somebody can make a profit out of it? That is the motive force within a capitalist or free market society. Or do we go down the model of the principles behind our National Health Service of you produce a service for the needs of the people that need it, rather than those that can afford to pay for it, which then leads us on to questions about how you move in that direction. I don't propose or want wholesale nationalisation of every industry and every service. I think that is complicated and difficult. I do think central services like health, housing, education, energy, transport ought to be, and water, ought to be publicly owned. But it's also about how we have a taxation system and whether or not we couldn't have a redressive balance in our taxation system, so you move into the direction of something like universal basic income, where you guarantee everybody a basic living standard and level within society. I know there are complications surrounding it, there are always complications, but these are issues that socialists have to discuss, take up and focus on, because that way we can begin to provide real hope and start to redress the fundamental imbalances in society where working class kids achieve less in school, achieve less in adulthood, and too many live in poverty. And because in my country we've gone into a in my view, unfortunate direction of highly competitive education between schools and between students, it's great when you can go to a school and the 6 most able students are brought in front of you and they've achieved great grades and they've achieved places in Oxford, Cambridge or other big famous universities. Fantastic, well done them. But what about the others that didn't make it up the league table? What about the others that didn't get to college? What about the others that are not making the most of their opportunities and their abilities? And that surely is a question for socialists. Education has to be for all children, for all people, and which is why I was very proud to put in our 2017 and in more detail in 2019 manifesto the principle of a national education service which provided free education, as I put it, from cradle to grave. So there'd be no charges at any stage for education and absolutely no charges for students to go to university. Students now in Britain are leaving university with debts for fees and living of sometimes £60,000 or £70,000 before they get a job. So they've got this debt hanging over them forevermore. And so defending the principle of free education is to me very important. But we need to live also in a world of peace. As I said at the beginning, I've been in the campaign for nuclear disarmament all my life, and I have always sought for and argued for peace and the justice that goes with it. I couldn't give you the exact number, but I would hazard to say there are probably 30 or 40 wars going on in this world at the present time. On Monday, I'll be at a demonstration outside the Indonesian embassy in Britain in support of the people of West Papua who are under occupation from the Indonesian army. Why? Because there are minerals there, because there's a big mining company there, and that mining company wants to continue polluting the river and exploiting the resources that are there. My late brother used to live in Papua New Guinea, which is across the border in Papua New Guinea. And they are being brutally attacked for demanding independence after the so-called Act of Free Choice many years ago. It's not a war that's very well known about, but the British and European arms manufacturers are selling arms to Indonesia, which have been used to repress the people of West Papua. That's one war that the media are not reporting. There is the most grotesque violations of human rights and child labour going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo at the present time. The numbers of children that are working, not being in school, are working, digging cobalt and coltan, ultimately coltan, out of the ground, which is eventually sold on to the global mining corporations and eventually processed into coltan, which is in every single one of our mobile phones here today. These are children denied education, denied sufficient food, just being exploited in the African country with the most natural resources of any African country. The militias are well armed, and they are supporting the mining companies. It's the most grotesque piece of inequality almost anywhere in the world, and destructive of the environment. And that there are many, many other conflicts. I opposed the Gulf War, and particularly the war that started after 9/11. 9/11 was a disaster. It was a terrible, horrible, wrong, totally wrong thing to do. But the subsequent invasion of Afghanistan, which has gone on for 20 years, cost billions of dollars in arms expenditure by those countries that took part in it and the NATO forces that went there, and has left behind the poorest country in the world, the most hungry country in the world, and the country with the least respect for human rights of any sort anywhere in the world. That is the legacy of the Western intervention. And when I get up in Parliament and demand that we provide more resources to at least provide food aid on an emergency basis to the people of Afghanistan, I'm not particularly supportive of the Taliban, I don't suppose anybody here is at all, but there has to be a recognition of the needs of those people. So war is very popular at the time you call it. It's very popular when the glamour and so on of it goes on. But the reality afterwards is the destruction. And the reality also is the mental health conditions of those soldiers that come back from those particular wars. And the Iraq War was no exception. Which then leads me on to the current conflict in Ukraine. Let's be clear, Russia is absolutely wrong to invade and try and occupy the Ukraine. It's against law, international law. It's completely the wrong thing to do. And this war has cost the lives of thousands of Ukrainian citizens. Many have been forced into refugee status or exile. And the Russian soldiers have died. Russian civilians have died. Every parent grieves the loss of their son or daughter in a war, whether they're Ukrainian, Russian, Iraqi, British, Palestinian, or whatever, anywhere else. They go through that pain of the loss. Surely to goodness, if Russia and Ukraine are capable of talking to each other about a grain deal to ensure the export of grain, then they're capable of talking to each other to at least bring about a ceasefire. And I think it's a failure by the United Nations and by the European Union that a ceasefire was not negotiated very early on, or at least an intervention of some sort to try and prevent it. And it's to the credit of the Latin American leaders and the African leaders that they've at least done their best to intervene, to try to bring about that peace process that will bring about, hopefully, a cessation of hostilities and some kind of interlocutor that can deal with the issues of the Crimea and the Donbass. It cannot be that we're just going to be spectators in this destruction of human life there. And so I do support the Russian peace protesters, just as I support those in Ukraine. And I'm sure you would all join with me in demanding that the Russian authorities release Boris Kargalitsky from prison as a great peace campaigner and socialist in Russia, who should be supported by all of us. And so it is that voice for peace that we have to put forward. And people say to me, well, you're very good at describing all the problems of the world. What are you going to do about it? Don't you all get these questions? No? Right. It's fundamentally, socialism is about the empowerment of people, the liberation of people from oppression, from poverty, and from the straitjacket of the kind of society that free market capitalism wants to put them into. And that fundamentally comes back to where I started. It's about inspiration, and it is about art and inspiration that goes with it. Scientific developments come through inspiration and through ideas. Art comes from inspiration and ideas. Poetry comes from inspiration and ideas. It's that creative endeavor that's there in all humans. They look at what we've got and look at how you can utilize it to make our lives sustainable. Iceland is an example. Northern country, pretty cold by my standards, okay, but very nice. What have you got? fish, air, and lots and lots of hot water. Fantastic. So that the development of the Icelandic economy is a tribute to those that have managed to sustain and exercise use of the natural resources that's offered. That comes from science, it comes from imagination, which is why I think as socialists we have to understand the history that we've come from. And understanding of history is crucial to our attitudes today. Why do right-wing forces always play on an issue of racial superiority between Europe, Africa, Latin America, and so on? They're sort of replaying some kind of European colonial mentality. I have a very good friend of mine, a man called Remy Capo, comes from Nigeria, and has written a trilogy of novels about the African slave trade and slave ships that went from the Guinea coast, as it was called, to the Americas and the Caribbean. And the story is about slaves that managed to escape, and some of them got to London and some of them got to other places, and the slave captures. But all the time, what runs through the novel is the way in which the countries where the slave ships came from, Britain, France, etc., were all taught that somehow or other African people were inferior, so that the working class could then believe that they were better because they came from Africa, or better than somebody that came from India. That sort of racial superiority. That hasn't completely gone away. In the United States, the slave trade may have been abolished. Slavery may have been abolished. They may all, quite rightly, laud the work of Harriet Tubman and others that helped to free slaves. But 100 years later, the racism was still there, hence Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Act. Fast forward another 50 years, and the death of George Floyd, 60 years rather, death of George Floyd shows the racism is still there within the USA and with other societies. And so it is about our understanding of history and the way in which we teach our children who invented what, who did what. All great inventions didn't come just from Europe or the USA. They came from China, they came from India, they came from Southern Africa. There's a fantastic book by by Walter Rodney called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. It's turning history on its head and challenging the way in which African development or underdevelopment actually happened. So our job as socialists is to understand that history, understand that process, but above all, empower people, particularly young people, to have some hope for the future. And you achieve a lot of that through creativity. So we support those that are victims, we support those that are the underdogs, but above all, we have that principle and that hope, and that means we have to work together to achieve it. I started with a plea for Julian Assange's freedom, and I'll end with that, because Julian Assange being freed, and I'm not sure it's going to happen, we're going to have to fight like anything to get it, and it's coming up again in the courts, and you and I have done many, many public meetings and rallies on this. But he exposed not just the military activities of various countries, almost every country in fact, but he also exposed the activities of global corporations in the destruction of our natural world and the exploitation of some of the poorest and most vulnerable people on the planet. It's those principles, those demands and those hopes that brings us together, and that is what fundamentally we can have joy working together to achieve that better socialist future for everybody. Thank you very much.
I could well think of clapping for the rest of the meeting. We have 30 minutes left, just over 30 minutes, and we finish the meeting at, as I said.
Does that mean I was too long?
No. So if there are questions or comments, then I have a microphone here. Yeah. I will. Yes, it's working like that. And please introduce yourselves. Take the floor.
My name is Sveinn Rúnar Hauksson, and I started out with newspapers like you. When I was 5, I was forbidden by my parents, or it was negotiated that I stop it until I was 6. So from then on. Today I have been a family doctor for more than 40 years, but there's a lot, and thank you very much for your lecture. And we share a lot. In Iceland we have had a campaign against military bases, and we have been happy to be in connection with the CND and the END. And there has been a Vietnam Solidarity Committee and many others. And since '87 we have had Association Iceland-Palestine. There are so many things I would like to ask you, but there's actually only one question which I will put to you, and it has to do with Palestine. And your leadership of the Labour Party gave many people in Iceland, not only Britain, but around the world, hopes for a different future, that there might be a more peaceful future. When it came to an end, your leadership, we could understand that part of it at least had been a campaign of accusation against you, untrue accusations of being anti-Semitic. Today it is somehow, even with when the fascists have taken over in the government of Israel, they still enjoy great successes, at least in the major media. And also in the law, making of law in the countries around us, where it is even becoming illegal to criticize Israel or to criticize Zionism. It is all given the name anti-Semitism. And at the same time we see that no one is more welcome in Israel, no one gets a better reception, more honorable reception than politicians like Orban of Hungary, who had just revived a Nazi general with a ceremony before he came to Israel, and was received in the Knesset and so on with the highest honors. Because it seems also that people who are really on the far right, really on the close to the Nazi ideology, that they are necessary for the Zionism and for those who are now leading Israel. I would like to hear what was your experience of this. Thank you.
We'll take more questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Corbyn, for your wonderful talk. My name is Guðfríður Lilja Grétarsdóttir. And thank you, of course, above all, for your amazing work through the years and the decades. You've touched upon a lot of different issues, amongst others the colossal environmental degradation that our planet is facing, the extremely exploitative use of natural resources for private profit and not for the benefit of the people. and because that the impoverished are above all paying for all of this. Now, the question is very simple. To what extent, in your opinion, if you are environmentalists, if you do want to save our planet, our ecosystems, our forests, our animals that are being exterminated, etc., and human life as such, to what extent must you then be anti-capitalist? And by the same token, how do you then answer the common critique of others who want to kind of greenwash or green the capitalist and neoliberal system, amongst others by pointing out to the ways in which the Soviets and others in the past were also environmentally destructive? I'd love to hear you kind of extrapolate a bit of this and expand on these issues. Thank you.
We'll do 2, 3 more.
Thank you so much. My name is Sanna Magdalena Marstadóttir. I'm a city councillor for the Socialist Party. You ended on the note that we can have joy working together, and I think it's amazing, like working with all of my comrades and colleagues together. You get a sense of like belonging to a bigger community, but sometimes you get like so wrapped in the work and the injustice and get like really angry when you're trying to make the situation better here in the community. So I just want to ask, like, do you have any notes or like ideas for us and not to forget that joy of working together? Thank you so much.
1 or 2 more.
Thank you, Mr. Corbyn. My name is Haukon. I lived in London for 10 years, so I survived the Johnson mayoral era. I had 2 questions, but I'll stick to the more serious one since there are so many people here. I was wondering if you would be willing to sign my Have a Jerry Christmas. After the meeting. Yeah. It's related to me for 7 years now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy Corbyn. Excellent talk. I want to ask you a question about these wonderful projects that you're doing now. You're talking about building more democracy instead of having public ownership through state institutions to build more democracy locally. So my question to you is then, do we perhaps need to look at different traditions of socialism, not only social democracy, but perhaps anarchism, to actually build the society we want today in the society we live in now, instead of waiting for the state to hand us the fruits of what we have created? Thank you.
There are more people who have asked for the floor, but we will make a pause now.
There's quite a lot there.
I'll speak from here because it's got a better microphone. First of all, thank you very, very much for the questions. I feel slightly embarrassed that I speak English and French and Spanish a little bit, those two. I don't speak any of your language at all. And everyone here comes to listen to somebody speaking in English. It really is humbling that you all speak English so well. Thank you very much for that. And you must have a good education system that people learn so much English. Or am I wrong? Okay, on the questions, first of all, thank you, Doctor, for your first question. Let's just be very, very clear on this. Racism is wrong in any form. Racism is an evil. Racism is designed to divide us. Anti-Semitism is one of the oldest forms of racism, goes back to the 12th century in the case of Europe or before that, and the many books that I have at home, such as The Legend of the Wandering Jew, and all the abuse that the Jewish communities all over Europe suffered for centuries. And the way they, in the case of Britain, they came back to Britain. The Jewish people were all expelled in the 13th century and came back in the 17th century. And the socialist tradition of the Bund, the Workers' Circle, the socialist tradition of Jewish communities in Russia, and many other places, something that I absolutely value and understand, and have been taught a great deal about this by very many very close friends who are studying history of the Bund and the working class Jewish organizations. And in my own family, the campaign against fascism in any form goes back a very long way. And indeed, my late mother was there at the Battle of Cable Street in 1936, when the fascists were prevented from marching through the working class communities of the East End of London. And so it is important to be absolutely clear that we oppose racism in any form. And it is perfectly possible and indeed necessary to discuss the injustice faced by the Palestinian people without resorting to anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish behavior in any way whatsoever. And it's quite important to say that. And indeed, I've worked very closely with a number of human rights organizations in Israel in support of the Palestinian people, and indeed spent a long time campaigning for the freedom of Mordechai Vanunu from prison in Israel. And I count amongst my other friends the great Professor Mads Gilbert for all the work that he did in Palestine during Operation Cast Lead, trying to defend the Palestinian people. And so it is important to caveat that at the beginning. The occupation of Palestine is wrong, the siege of Gaza is wrong, and the settlement policy is wrong. I've been 9 times in the area, and I've seen for myself what has happened and the humiliation of the occupation. Just imagine you all wanted to go somewhere this afternoon. Perhaps you all wanted to go to the Blue Lagoon this afternoon. And you had 6 roadblocks between here and the lagoon. It'd be closed by the time you got there. And then you'd have 6 more on the way back. And it'd probably be tomorrow morning before you got home. That's the reality of life for people in Palestine just trying to get around. I remember with my wife once trying to get from Jericho to Jerusalem. It took us 6 hours. Of stop, 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 search, 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 and so on. And we were foreign visitors. Imagine you're a building worker. You're trying to get to your work, and you can't get there because an Israeli soldier won't let you get there. And that humiliation that goes on all the time, which is why I was very determined to include quite clearly in our manifesto unilateral, unconditional recognition of the state of Palestine from day one of a government that we would bring into office, and joining in actually with a large number of other people around the world. The British government has now tried to put through Parliament called the anti-BDS bill, which is boycott, divestment and sanctions, which is a big campaign. And they've named in it that it is illegal to campaign for sanctions by singling out the state of Israel for criticism. And therefore it would be illegal for any public authority to do that. And moreover, to give the Secretary of State the power to decide which countries at any time it's okay to organise a boycott against. I took part in long campaigns of boycotting all South African goods. I was taught this by my parents as a child. Don't buy from apartheid until the apartheid system is finished. And that's the way I was brought up. Under this BDS bill, that would be illegal to campaign against it. To support Nelson Mandela would have been illegal in that time. And when Nelson Mandela finally came out of prison and came to visit the British Parliament, you'd have thought every single MP had been a member of the anti-apartheid campaign all their lives. You'd have think every single one of them was there at the Grutshaw prison trying to bring Mandela out. I mean, some people have very short memories. But it is important to show our solidarity with the people of Palestine and with comrades in Israel who are very bravely campaigning against the occupation of Palestine. And that is what I do. I received a very large amount of criticism for doing this, and some of the most disgusting things possible were said against me. I refute every single one of them. To my very fibre, I'll fight racism till the end of my life in any form that it appears, because we need unity against racism in any form. Oh, sorry. I thought you were heckling. Okay, sorry. I'm not normally... Okay, apologies. Right, the second question, thank you, was about environment and environmental degradation and destruction. And it's absolutely clear to me that the free market economy is designed to exploit natural resources. So we dig more and more iron ore out of the ground while leaving scrap metal to waste away and rust away and rot. We deliberately waste an awful lot of things. We produce a vast amount of plastic goods because it's profitable to do so, knowing full well that they cannot biodegrade in any way. We leave that to go to waste, and it will still be waste 500 years, 1,000 years on from now, unbiodegraded. So we have to think quite seriously about these things. There is a profit incentive in waste, a profit incentive in built-in obsolescence of goods, and so on, which is why we have to start looking at other solutions. So in terms of production, for example, in the steel industry, which Britain still has a steel industry, not as big as it used to be, but there is one, as in the Netherlands, France, Germany, Belgium, and so on, they are only now beginning to transfer into electric arc furnaces, which are more sustainable and less polluting than blast furnaces, and use scrap metal, of which there is a vast amount. At the moment, we're exporting scrap metal from Europe to China to re-import steel-made goods from China. That's mad in terms of the environmental destruction of a ship carting this waste, this scrap metal to China and then bringing back the finished goods. We have to think very carefully about trade arrangements and trade agreements, which is why I was very keen on that any trade agreements we made, whether within the EU or post-EU membership in Brexit, do also have environmental considerations within them on food miles as well as production things. So it is about that. Now, your point you made about greenwash is a very good one. I was at COP25 in Paris, which was very interesting and was quite well organised, and I met an amazing number of environmental groups from different countries, from Bolivia, from India, from China, and so not so many from China, but other countries in Asia. And I felt there was genuine progress being made there. I went and we had an alternative event at COP26 in Glasgow, and a lot of it was frankly an exercise in greenwash. I discovered, for example, that a company that in my own community was bidding to become the contractor to build a new incinerator to deal with the waste that's produced in North London, which I think is wrong, and we should be phasing out incinerators, not developing more of them, and therefore enforcing the pace on recycling and reuse of things. I found that this company that I'd been campaigning against was invited centre stage to present something about the sustainability of incineration, knowing full well you burn plastic at any temperature, it gives off some nasty substances that get up in the upper atmosphere and come down somewhere and end up here in our lungs. And so the exercise in greenwash is phenomenal. And I was staring at some advertising posters put out by British Petroleum this week in London, or BP as they now call themselves. And it got pictures of flowers and pictures of trees and pictures of electric cars and electric charging points. And it said, BP is for the environment. And then it said in very small letters at the end, and we will only continue exploiting oil and gas as long as necessary. But that was in tiny letters at the bottom of it. That's a wonderful example, in my view, of greenwash. The other point you made is a very important one, is about biodiversity. We are destroying the natural world quite rapidly. Half the species that have ever been made extinct in the planet's history have happened during my lifetime in the past 70 years. And the levels of destruction of the biodiverse society are getting worse and worse. Many of our children are brought up in the case of my country anyway, not so much here I suspect, with very little personal outdoor space of their own. Many have no gardens, some have no balconies. Their only access to open space is a park or a schoolyard, and are brought up actually some distance away from nature. Now, people might say, okay, well, so what? I think it's actually quite important that our children are brought up understanding that biodiversity, insects, bees, wasps, birds, animals and so on, are actually essential for our lives. We cannot live without nature, but nature can live without us. And so we have to understand that our education system needs to encourage the learning of biodiversity as well as environmental destruction that goes with it. That will bring up the adults of the future. They'll be prepared to do something more about it. But that also means you have to look at the question I raised earlier on. Do we produce for need or do we produce for profit? As socialists, we say produce for need, not profit. That doesn't mean you have to impose some bureaucratic structure on people, but you have to take your point of encouraging community operations and community actions. Many of the early socialists from the time of the English Civil War onwards, in the case of my country, developed their own socialist societies through cooperatives, the famous cooperatives in Scotland and in other places, developed that sense of community living and cooperation that went with it. The co-op movement in Britain came from working class communities in Lancashire, famously at Tubbs Lane in Wigan, where they set up a food co-op, and that developed into a massive cooperative organisation. Maybe it's a bit too big now, but nevertheless, the principles are there. So I take your point that it isn't just about us theorising, it's about practically how you do things. And in my own constituency, there are probably 10 housing cooperatives. They're not actually very, very big. They are places that people got together, bought a property together, cannot sell it on for individual benefit, but can move in or out of the co-op. So the co-op retains the property and the value that goes with it, and they have a very low rent as a return, and they're all expected to take part in the running and administration of it. And I find as the local MP that over the years I get large numbers of individual problems brought to me by lots of people, all kinds of different problems, understandably. But very, very few ever come from anyone living in a cooperative property. That sense of living and working together is quite important. So the practical work of doing that, and the one thing that COVID taught us was that we need each other. And all those people that took part in mutual aid projects in my area, in supporting people through mental health stress and through poverty and hunger, meant a big change in attitude, and less of an attitude of I'm okay because I'm doing all right but my neighbour isn't, much more supportive of each other on their neighbourhood approach. And so it is about the joy of how we do things as socialists. Thank you for your question from the Socialist Party. Doing stuff together does actually bring some sense of joy, and that's where the principles of music and culture that go with our work, and some of you may have been to it. Every year in the northeast of England in Durham, we have the annual Miners' Gala, which is commemorating the strength of the mining communities. There's no coal mines left in Durham. But the festival has got bigger, and the principles behind it are stronger than they've ever been. 200,000 people came to this year's Durham Miners' Gala, which is a festival of the miners' bands and music and the beauty and artwork of the miners' banners. And so those traditions are there within our movement. And your jersey over there deserves a reciprocal present. So on my next visit, I'll bring you a jar of Jezza's jam as thanks for that, because I enjoy making our jam. Now, the Peace and Justice Project's involved in a lot of campaigns, and we have about about 60,000 people signed up to the project in various ways, and they receive regular emails. We're producing books that I explained, the poetry book. We're also producing a book early next year on the global arms trade. And again, this has been written jointly with people in different parts of the world, in India, in South Africa, in the United States, in Latin America, pointing out the skills that go into the arms industry and the destructive power of the arms industry and the malevolent influence of the arms industry, but also how those skills could be unleashed to produce other things. Now, you might say, well, this is all utopian stuff. No, it's not. It's practical work to try and bring about a safer and more secure world. And the Peace and Justice Project is doing all of that, and working with other people. We have not set ourselves up in competition with every other left group, so the sectarian issues simply don't arise, and I don't ever want them to. I want us to be focused entirely on solidarity work and campaigning, on the right to food, on the right to clothing, on supporting people trying to get union recognition, and supporting those struggles and producing this sort of creative need. We're also doing something that's very popular called Music for the Many, where we're organising music concerts at different music venues all around the country, where we're defending live music, because so many young people are very keen on producing their own music. Fantastic music it often is, can't get produced, can't find anywhere to rehearse, can't find anywhere to perform. And so we've got these Music for the Many concerts all over the country, and thousands of people come along to them because they enjoy the music and they enjoy the principles behind it, that we can admire each other's creativity. We can be creative in lots of ways, and we should never turn our backs on the ability of communities to produce their own art, their own poetry, their own culture, and their own scientific endeavour. But it is about socialists being active in and part of the community, which is why I wanted to convert the Labour Party into a community organising operation, in which we were there as community organisers from the party trying to achieve change. And that is where I achieved the biggest level of opposition I could ever possibly encounter, from people who felt their career path within a bureaucracy was under threat by community organisers bringing the public and communities into political life. I don't apologise for any of it. That is the way forward to socialism. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Saifur. Thank you for your talk, and also thank you for the example that you have shown through your career. I'm wondering if for someone who is inspired but might want to do things with maybe more aggression or more boldness, that the frustrations of watching previous attempts makes us want to be more aggressive. What kind of wisdom would you maybe give to someone with these kind of feelings from watching your lessons and experience?
I think we can't take one more. I think. Thank you. Were you asking?
Chairman, my name is Aurelija Blomqvist. I've been an admirer of yours for many years. I wanted to ask you about the current leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer. His many faults are very apparent, and the specific one I wanted to ask about is that recently he has been an avid enabler of transphobia. And I want to ask...
what, sir?
Transphobia. Yeah. Well, I do believe his name may be pronounced Kid Starver now after the recent debacle. But yes, I wanted to ask you about what you think is the correct course of action when someone who claims to be a leader for the people repeatedly stands against principles for the people and ousts anyone who stands for what's right.
I'm sorry to say you only have 3 minutes. Why is that?
Thanks. Very briefly, first of all, your question is a very fair one and a very good one about aggression and so on, the way we do politics. It's very easy to be incredibly aggressive against somebody you disagree with, and it's very easy to get into levels of personal abuse against them. And to begin with, it can be quite funny. You know, two politicians calling each other terrible names and terrible things and saying, you're worse than a worm, no, you're worse than a reptile, and so on and so on. It doesn't actually get anybody anywhere. And it actually puts people off, because you're not actually offering anything other than the fact you clearly don't like this other person. And since not everybody is completely attuned to everything that goes on in politics, they simply don't understand it. They think, oh, so what? And so it is about how you approach things, and also whether you want leadership to be about imposing ideas and imposing things on people, or things to be developed by the majority of your membership or your population. I certainly would put myself in the camp of the latter. That has with it its problems, because at one level you're facing very serious and very strong and very well organised opposition, and one way is to fight it bureaucratically. The other way is to try and oppose it by developing a different organisational culture, which is what I've always tried to do and tried to develop. Now, that does have within it various problems, and certainly it's very well known, the facts of the whole thing. I was elected leader by a very large vote of party members and supporters. I was challenged less than 9 months later and was re-elected by an even larger majority by the people that felt the challenge on me was unfair. But that was not the end of the story by any means. And after the 2017 election, in which the support for the Labour Party during the campaign went from 24% to 41% during the campaign, because of the strength of campaigning zeal of our supporters all over the country, that's when the media campaign was much, much stronger. And that's why I would urge you all to think very, very seriously about what I said earlier. Questions of media ownership, questions of media control, questions of access to the media and diversity of ownership. I hear that Rupert Murdoch is now stepping back from running the Murdoch empire. I suspect this is not the end of the Murdoch empire. I think the Murdoch empire is still there and very, very strong. And so we do have to have this serious discussion about how we approach media and things. But as in politics, you have to attract people to your ideas. It isn't always achieved just by being aggressive against the other person. It's much more attractive if you can attract people to your ideas and also listen to the ideas that come forward. Some of the wisest people I've ever met come from the most unlikely circumstances. I've met some incredibly wise people who are sleeping on the streets of my city, and I talk to them and listen to what their views are. Never be so high and mighty or so proud that we can't listen to the views of other people and try, if we can, incorporate them in what we do. The last question was about the current leader of the Labour Party and issues of identity politics. As far as I'm concerned, trans rights are human rights and they should be respected for that, and I don't really want to get beyond that in that debate. Human rights means that people should be respected for what they are and what they identify themselves to be. That makes for a happier and much healthier society. As to the current directions of the party, my own politics, policies and so on are extremely well known, and I think to win an election against a disastrous Conservative government in Britain, it's not going to be done if all that's offered is a continuation of management economics without doing anything to tackle the fundamental and gross inequalities and injustices that exist within our society. Our movements, our trade unions, our socialist parties, our community organisations were all founded on the idea of challenging the fundamental inequality of hierarchical, capitalist, market-orientated societies. If all we can offer is to carry on managing on the same budgets that these people have created such dreadful levels of poverty, misery, and mental health crisis within our society. Well, it ain't much to offer. We've got to raise the sights and raise the hopes of people. This world has enough food to feed everybody. This world has enough biodiversity to sustain everybody. This world doesn't have to be a world of war, a world of inequality, or a world of poverty. It can be overcome and conquered. It's not simple, it's not easy, but it's not a law of nature that one person is much richer than the other. It's a law of nature that we all want to survive by supporting each other. Those are the kind of socialist ideas and socialist beliefs that can give us that strength. And uniting together, that's why I put together, or we put together, not me, others did as well, the 5 principles. They're not because they're the last word in politics, they're not. But there's something around which we can unite and campaign. And you know that feeling. When you've been through a campaign to get a new hospital, to get a school, to win a wage rise, to prevent somebody being unfairly dismissed from their work, prevent an injustice like Julian Assange. The strength you feel when you've won that campaign means you can indeed win all the other campaigns. Thank you.
There is nothing to be... There is nothing to be added. Thank you for coming.